Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. In episode 47, we're going to have a look at yesterday's extraordinary press conference by Lucy Letby's new barrister, Mark McDonald.
Today, the defence are announcing that they will be immediately seeking permission from the Court of Appeal to take the exceptional but necessary decision to apply to reopen the appeal of Lucy Letby and immediately review all her convictions. In August 2023, Lucy Letby was convicted in the Crown Court at Manchester after a trial lasting 10 months, on 7 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. On the 24th of May of this year, the matter was before the Court of Appeal, but all applications for leave to appeal were refused. The primary ground of appeal at the previous hearings related to the admissibility before the jury of evidence from the lead prosecution expert, Dr. Darry Evans. The defence argued twice at the trial that Dr. Evans' evidence should be disregarded. This was refused by the trial judge. It was then later argued in the Court of Appeal. That was refused by the Court of Appeal. Remarkably, Dr. Evans has now changed his mind on the cause of death of 3 of the babies, baby C, baby I, and baby P. Dr. Evans had said to the jury that Lucy Letby had injected air down a nasal gastric tube and that this had led to the death of the 3 babies. This was repeated to the Court of Appeal, who may have been misled when they ruled on the applications for leave of conviction in the May of last year. Dr. Evans has also said that he has revised his opinion in relation to baby C and has written a new report that he has given to the police. This was some weeks, actually months ago now. Despite numerous requests, the prosecution have yet to give this report to the defence. The defence will argue that Dr. Evans is not a reliable expert, and given that he was the lead expert for the prosecution, we say that all the convictions are unsafe.
I've always considered the law to be a bit of a joke in the UK, and indeed in Ireland, where we more or less copy what they do in the UK. You have 2 groups of people: the solicitors, who are the kind of general practitioner jobbing guys that are on the high street, and they make their money selling houses, making wills, small claims and things like that. Do you need a solicitor to buy a house? No. Do you need a solicitor to make a will? No. Do you need a solicitor to sue someone if the sum was less than £10,000? No. Is it overly hard to do these things without solicitors? Yes, because that's the way they want it. And then you have barristers. These are the lawyers who wear a wig. And how far back does it go that barristers wore a wig? It started in 1680, during the reign of Charles II, and it was a fashion amongst the aristocracy and the upper classes. And everyone moved on from fashions as they usually do. Barristers hung on to the wigs. But like the last pair of bell-bottoms you have from the 1970s, the barristers held on to the wigs, and by 1820, all but the barristers had abandoned the wig. In 1822, the Humphrey Ravenscroft patent powderless wig became the standard for barristers and remains so today. By 1844, it was formally recognised that barristers were not to be heard in court without wig and gown. Prosecutors in the UK, supposedly, are bound by ethical rules and legal standards of procedure, and their role is to ensure justice is served. The prosecutors represent the state or the government, working on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service in England and Wales. Prosecutors must ensure that justice is done fairly and impartially, and they present evidence to prove the guilt of a person. But prosecutors have to follow the code of Crown prosecutors, which requires them to satisfy the full code test. And the full code test involves determining if there's sufficient evidence for a realistic prospect of conviction and the prosecution is in the public interest. And that's where the whole thing falls flat on its face. For almost 9 months, the prosecutor in the Lucy Letby case presented the most absurd collection of scientific nonsense that I've ever heard in my life, appearing to me anyway, that the only thing that you need to pass the full code test is to have a spoofer like Dowie Evans, willing to sit in the stand, make up shit, and tell a jury story after story that makes no sense and that no other doctor will accept as being remotely connected to the profession that we follow. So you would think that if Dowie Evans was so outrageously wrong about everything that he said, that the prosecutor would definitely know. And to pass the full code test, he would say, listen, I can't go into court with that crap. But apparently that isn't the case. In the last 46 or whatever number it is podcast that I've done, I pointed out the inherent flaws in everything practically that Dowie Evans says, and as a consequence, nearly everything that the other experts said, because basically all they did was echo Dowie Evans. We set aside formal postmortems, which are by far the best way humans have to work out how a baby or another person died. It is without doubt the gold standard for telling you how a death took place. For the 7 murders for which Letby was found guilty, there were 6 postmortems, none of which show any evidence of criminal assault or indeed any other criminal act perpetrated by Lucy Letby. But these gold standard tests were simply ignored or put into the appendages of the evidence in the trial. The victims of the Countess of Chester Hospital, the parents, in most cases, gave much more accurate information than any of the so-called expert witnesses. But the families too were a footnote in this trial. It's very hard looking back to wonder what the hell this trial was really all about and how it ever got off the ground and sustained itself for 9 months. It will go down in history as one of the worst trials in British legal history. And Mark McDonald, without his wig on yesterday, fired the starting pistol that will propel this trial into the history book. Mark essentially had 2 points that he wanted to make, and he had with him Peter Elston in case there was any questions about statistics, Richard Taylor, a practicing neonatologist, and Roger Norris, who was a retired pediatrician. And the substance of the evidence was essentially this, that the charlatan known as Dowie Evans, having approached the Countess of Chester Hospital himself and became the beating heart of Operation Hummingbird, has so many psychopathic tendencies that he cannot stop talking. His notions of himself are grandiose, and he seems unable to accept that he can be wrong, or that when the trial is over, he's supposed to stop talking about it. Instead, he carried on talking about it. He couldn't stop talking about it. And in the course of talking about it, I think he kind of realized that people were no longer interested in hearing him. So he did what all kind of sociopath, psychopath type people do. He upped the ante because he's a risk taker too. I can't know, of course, if Gary Evans is a psychopath or sociopath because I haven't examined him, and I would have no desire to examine him. I'm just talking about traits, grandiosity, lying on a grand scale, lacking any empathy whatsoever, not only for Lucy Letby and her family, but for the family of these dead children. He seems to have no connection to their loss. Psychopaths actually have a limited emotional range. They're physically not capable of demonstrating emotion the way most of us can, by getting overly angry, overly sad, so that every time you see them, no matter what's happening, they're usually in the same emotional groove. They're also usually impulsive risk takers. And this was well demonstrated in the trial when Gary Evans actually came up with diagnoses on the stand that weren't in any of these so-called expert reports that he'd written over the previous 8 or 9 years. It can be superficially charming, but it doesn't take much to get to the shallowness of the reality of that. They're callous people. They lie and deceive without remorse, without any sense of the harm that they've done to others. When Lord Justice Jackson wrote to the court, to Justice Gost in the court, and warned him to be wary of Gary Evans, I'm sure he didn't do that lightly. But he gave an example of a report that Evans had produced for another civil trial, in which he said basically that the report was worthless and that Evans failed to take account of what his colleagues said. In other words, the medical knowledge base, and instead chose to make up his own stuff to fit the goal that he was trying to achieve at the time. And of course, when this was put to him by Ben Myers in the court, Gary Evans said that Justice Jackson was wrong, that Evans himself considered the report in question as being rather a good report, which is so typical of psychopathic behavior. So whether or not Gary Evans is a psychopath, I don't know, and I don't particularly care. But psychopaths, even though they may seem on the up most of the time, that they're achieving, they generally don't have a life goal. They don't achieve the simple things that most of us do. Have a successful family, have good friends, try and be decent and look after one another. And they crave the limelight all the time when they get to the point where they're being noticed and where people are listening to them. And they just simply can't shut up. And his big mouth, Gary Evans' big mouth, is really what Mark McDonald was talking about yesterday, amongst other things. And Mark's point was that this fool, having given his evidence in court and told the jury that Lucy Letby killed babies by injecting air down into their stomachs in a busy neonatal unit, often in a manner that would have a delayed effect, as if you could light a fuse and wait for the symptoms to happen. When the trial was over and no one was interested in them anymore, He just kept talking to get more and more attention and changed his mind about what he said in court. Evans no longer believed, like the rest of us, that it is actually possible to kill a baby by injecting air down a nasogastric tube. It may be, but if you're going to put that amount of air into a baby, it's going to take some time. You're going to get notice, and the effect on the baby will be immediate. Babies who are 2 weeks old can pass as much as 2.5 litres of air out every day. And this is air that they've swallowed during feeding or in cases where they're on high-flow nasal cannulas or continuous positive airway pressure, where the air is quite literally pushed into the abdomen. Harry must have known that that was a real stretch, and he used it as a kind of fill-in when he couldn't fit his silly little air embolism theory into the story. And he ignored the findings of superior practitioners like pathologists in favour of his own childish and quite bizarre theories. So Mark's point is that now that the chief witness or the prosecution has withdrawn his evidence effectively after the fact, that this should go back to the Court of Appeal directly without going through the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And this is going to present a real dilemma for these judges who seem more interested in their mundane and outdated method than actually achieving justice by finding the truth. And one of the journalists there did ask if this was unprecedented, and Mark McDonald, the barrister, said it probably was unprecedented. So we have a real dilemma on our hands here. The judges in the appeal court prided themselves on the depth and breadth of their consideration of all of the evidence when they had decided to refuse Letby leave to appeal. So what are they going to do now? It seems to me that they've only got two choices. They're going to stick to their guns and say, no, a witness changing his evidence after the fact doesn't really matter. Or they're going to do the right thing and say that Letby should be granted leave to appeal. But granting leave to appeal to Lucy Letby is going to open up another can of worms. And I doubt very much whether the Crown Prosecution Service would try her again, because I doubt that they could find any experts who were willing to work for them. And what would this do? This would leave Lucy Letby still a murderer in the eyes of many people, and it would leave the families, most of all, no better off than where they are today. So in that regard, I really wish Mark the best of luck, because alone I think he is shaking the foundation of the so-called British justice system. But the new evidence that Mark claims he has, which are opinions really, and I'm not so sure that the judges will have to go with that, are the ongoing compilation of the true expert report on each of the babies. And at this press conference, they talked about Baby O, which was a source of great enlightenment for me. One of the things that I didn't know about Baby O, because it wasn't discussed in the court that I could see, was whether or not the pressure of the ventilator had been set too high. Now, I think I said it probably was set high because the pressure in baby P, his triplet brother, was also set high. So there's no reason to doubt that it wasn't set high. But according to the new expert witnesses, indeed, the ventilatory pressures were too high. And this blasted so much air into the baby O, who had no serious underlying diseases at that point and didn't need ventilation, that the result was that they pushed the diaphragm down by expanding the lungs and pushed the liver down into the pelvis. Now, because there's such a small space inside a tiny little baby like that, that is absolutely perfectly possible. And these pressures, if they're not controlled, are incredibly destructive. And I did remark in my podcast on Baby O, The Road to Hell, Part 1, I think it was, that I couldn't understand why the consultants, the senior doctors supposedly, who were there with Baby O at the time he was deteriorating, left the scene. In other words, they allowed juniors to set up the high pressures and create the problem. Then they did very little, if anything, to correct that problem when they were attending this baby as its parents sat outside, and then they put it off. And Dr. Beery said in his evidence that he was called back at 4:30 p.m., as I recall, which was about 45 minutes after he had left. In my whole life working in hospitals, at least 10 years, I never seen a consultant leave an emergency situation until another consultant arrived or until the situation was brought under control. Now, that might be just luck on my part, I don't know, or it may be a reflection of a decline in standard. I don't know. But apparently, when this consultant came back and witnessed the terrible abdominal distension that the father had mentioned in his statement, and this must have been so painful for this baby, literally being torn apart inside by a hurricane. This consultant decided to stick a needle into the baby's abdomen in order to deflate it. Now, he has got to have known, or he should have known, because there was an x-ray there to show him that at some point the liver was in the pelvis. That doesn't necessarily mean it would still be in the pelvis at the time that he decided to make that decision and plunge a needle into the baby. But it would be a fair guess in that situation that the liver was not going to be where you would expect it to be. It was going to be displaced lower. And apparently he chose McBurney's point. Well, apart from the fact that McBurney's point wouldn't really be a thing in a neonate, it was the worst decision he could have made. Dr. Norris said a photograph showed where the needle went into the abdomen, or worse, where an incision was made. We'll have to wait until we see the full report. But a photograph was taken and the procedure was documented, and the consultant took a needle into the right side of the abdomen. If you were going to do something like this, and I did it once before on a young soldier with a gunshot wound, you would always go in from the left, and you always go in very cautiously, and you're kind of drawing back on this tube as you're going in because you want to see air, you do not want to see blood. Now, in the case of the soldier that I did it on or had to do it on, the air started gushing out of the hole, and we were really able to withdraw the needle and keep the wound open for a little minute, and the abdomen went down very quickly. And the problem was the pneumothorax. In this case, the consultant responsible for the death of Baby O apparently put the needle into the abdomen, penetrated the liver, left it there long enough for this ventilator to start churning it around like a meat chopper. And while he was doing that, he was drawing back blood from the baby. And in the process of doing that, the baby lost 50% of his blood, went into shock, hypovolemic shock, and could not be brought back from the brink. None of this, of course, was mentioned in court. It was hidden effectively from the jury by both the prosecution, who was supposed to ensure a fair trial, and the defence. We have to ask ourselves, and so do the appeal court judges, what would a jury have made of that? And how could the charlatan, Barry Evans, tie a little bubble of air into the vein to that amount of destruction several hours later? He couldn't have, which is why they left it out of the trial. But this consultant did this. It's documented. There are photographs. And now two neonatologists have written a report, both individually at first and then together, to say that this was the cause of death, shock as a consequence of overventilation, hypovolemia, and the hypovolemia consequent on the iatrogenic injury, that is, the doctor caused the injury by a needle inserted into the liver. And for me, this raises the question now of whether or not this constitutes what's called gross negligent manslaughter. If a doctor, if any of us do anything to a patient that's outrageously dangerous, even in an emergency situation, if what we do is not prescribed or orthodox and it results in harm or death to the patient, there may be a good case for gross negligent manslaughter. One of the journalists asked Dr. Taylor, the neonatologist who was at the press conference, did the doctor know he had caused this injury? But of course he knew it, because he documented it and he photographed it. But apparently the photographs, and maybe even the documentation, didn't make its way to the pathologist. That remains to be seen. But what he also did, he walked away from the dead infant, and he told the parents, or the consultants told the parents, that they didn't know why their baby had died. And if that is true, that they really didn't know what had caused the baby's death, then that in itself is a manifestation of profound incompetence, and in my opinion is grounds enough for that doctor to lose his license to practice, because he is fundamentally dangerous to the patients that come before him. Most of us know who this doctor is. There is no point in me saying who he is, because it will become general knowledge soon. But he was one of the gang of four who, instead of admitting to their mistake, getting help from other professionals around them, chose to hound Lucy Letby and participate as assistants in Operation Hummingbird, which was a profound mistake on the part of the police. Kind of sad moment in the middle of the press conference too was when, I think it was Jonathan Coffey, because I was watching it on the Mirror YouTube channel and the microphones weren't great. But I think it was Jonathan Coffey, friend of Judith Merritt and author of the book Unmasking Lucy Letby. He asked Mark McDonald what would happen if other experts disagreed with this conclusion made by the two, as they were referred to, domestic neonatologists. And I think it really goes to show just how little these people know about the subject on which they're writing. There will be no different conclusion, because there can't be any different conclusion. The liver is dislocated. You don't know where it is. You've pressurized the lungs so much. The abdomen followed, and it's now crushing, literally, all of the contents of the thoracic cavity. And instead of taking the pressure away and trying whatever method you could to reduce the abdominal distension, you choose to stick a needle to the right side of a baby's abdomen. You're not going to find physicians anywhere in the world who are going to tell you that is a good idea. And you're certainly not going to find any who are going to say, no, it wasn't that. It was Lucy Letby given 5 mils or a spoonful of air 4 hours earlier. Peter Hitchens, I think it was, he asked Did the prosecution know about this? Well, of course they knew about it. They had all the records, they had all the files, they had all the information that the two independent domestic neonatologists had. The only conclusion you can draw from this is that this information was willfully withheld from the jury. Now, that begs the question to me that apart from Sandy Bohan and Dr. Marnarides, the pathologist, did the other experts who were there, particularly Professor Arthurs, did they know that a consultant had placed a needle into the abdomen of a preterm neonate under pressure, and as a consequence of that, within an hour or two, found that the baby had lost half its hemoglobin? Did Professor Owen Arthurs know that that was the case? Let's remind ourselves of what Professor Owen Arthurs said. He told the court, this is gas throughout the gut. Now we know that coming from the ventilator. This degree of gas is quite unusual in a baby like this. He said potential causes were infection or necrotizing enterocolitis, a common bowel disorder in premature born babies. An alternative explanation was the administration of air via a nasogastric tube, he said. Dr. Arthurs came to the same conclusion regarding an X-ray of baby O captured hours before his death. He said, this shows a lot of gas in his stomach, small and large bowel. This is more than what we would expect in a normal baby. He did not say that one of the causes of that was overventilation. Surely that had to mean that Professor Owen Arthurs didn't know about the needle in the liver. Richard Taylor, the neonatologist, English-born, but based in Canada at the moment, who was at the press conference with Mark McDonald, he said that he wouldn't be able to sleep at night if he'd known that he had done this. I know exactly how he feels. Sometimes even on the verge of a mistake, when your instinct for something pulls you back from making a very serious mistake, that's enough to keep you awake for a long time. I wonder, did anyone from the Countess of Chester Hospital lose any sleep? Somehow I doubt it. They were too exhausted in general, maintaining the drawer of doom. In the press conference, they also talked about the incident cases. Peripherally, they talked about baby F, and Mark McDonald said he was expecting expert reports on baby F by January. So it looks like the press conferences will just keep rolling and rolling. And it appears that the blood sample used to take the immunoassay from, which is a useless test anyway, in this scenario, was contaminated itself. And the reason that they say it was contaminated, and contaminated simply means that the blood sample was not taken properly. That's just the easiest way to put it, that whatever way the blood sample was taken, some other substance got into it or corrupted it in some way, how it was stored or whatever. It's contaminated. It just means it's a useless sample and you have to take the sample again. And believe it or not, this happens very often. But they appear to know this because the laboratory verified. That means that the laboratory signed off on what the readings showed. Now, there may be some dispute about this from yet because these are really technical matters, but it appears that the machine read 999 decamoles per litre, verified. Decamoles per litre is the American measurement, and that would be converted then inside the machine to millimoles per litre, which would correspond to a reading of 54 millimoles per litre of glucose in the baby's blood. No one's blood can hold 54 millimoles per litre of glucose. And remember, the baby was being treated for hypoglycemia, low blood sugar at the time. Now, that blood sample was analysed in the Countess of Chester Hospital and not in Liverpool Women's Hospital, where the insulin D-peptide immunoassay test was done, did Anna Milan and Gwen Wark, the two senior biochemists who vouched for the integrity of the immunoassay test carried out in Liverpool Women's Hospital, did they know that this machine in the Countess of Chester Hospital had spat out a 54 millimoles per litre blood glucose from the same sample? And even if it wasn't from the same sample, it was at the same time. Did Professor Hindmarsh know this? Professor Hindmarsh read out a series of low blood sugars for baby F throughout his evidence in the trial, and nowhere did he mention a reading of 54 millimoles per litre, verified by the Countess of Chester Hospital Laboratory. And the shocking thing about this as well in the case of PBF is that this blood result came from the Thirlwell inquiry. It didn't come from the court transcripts. And I know that it's undergoing intense analysis by many people at the minute, because it isn't entirely clear where it came from. But it doesn't matter. The sample was contaminated. The laboratory should not have verified the result, and they should have informed the treating physicians that they needed another sample to do the test again. That means that the entire fantastical, trumped-up charge of baby F, where Letby spiked multiple bags that were never themselves checked to see was there any insulin in them, appears to be based on a flawed, contaminated sample. And with regards to the immunoassay test, Mark McDonald assured us that his experts throughout the world would be drawing up a report on that. And I hope that one of the things that they look at is what's called the validation for a test, the ISO Independent Standards Organization, validation for a test. The Roche Alexis immunoassay test that was used to convict Lizzie Letby for the attempted murder of 2 children by insulin poisoning was validated according to the sheet insert of the test on the pooled serum and plasma of 60 healthy adults. It likely doesn't have an ISO validation for use in a preterm neonate anyway. And if it doesn't have an ISO validation, it's not even useless as a forensic tool. It's utterly useless as a clinical tool. When Mark had finished his opening statement and he threw the floor open to questions, I thought the journalists were stunned. The first person to ask the question was John Sweeney, who's just completed the wonderful podcast series, Was There Ever a Murder? And the mainstream journalists just seemed stunned. The questions they asked were largely inane, because I don't think that the reality of what Mark was saying has sunk in yet. And can you imagine, although it couldn't have been avoided, but can you imagine being the mother and father of baby O and hearing this, probably for the first time, at a press conference about your baby, and the parent of baby F hearing this at a press conference about the attempted murder of your baby? This is now such a shit show, and I don't know how the judiciary are going to get themselves out of it. As far as I'm concerned, having done this podcast series out of a sense of outrage, because I truly love medicine and value what it has given the world and how it has enriched my life. I know that this steam train is just getting going. I know that Lucy Letby didn't harm these babies in the way that they said she harmed these babies. And this locomotion of shocking event where one of the journalists actually said to Richard Taylor that he looked quite emotional when he was describing the death of baby O. because he was quite emotional when he was describing the death of Baby O. This is not academic. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's not about procedures and systems, judges and juries, barristers in wigs. It's about the fundamental dignity of human life. Mark McDonald put them all on warning that this is not going to stop, and that the evident corruption of this trial is really going to expose a very rotten system. And we have to hope that this will end up being a good thing, and that Britain will consider, along with Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Scotland and Wales, moving away from this adversarial approach to criminal justice, moving away from fault finding in genuine mistakes that end up making lawyers tons of money but don't get the lesson driven home. With any luck, the Lucy Letby case will sow the seeds of reform that are seriously needed to correct this appalling system that we have. And I would warn people not to get too excited. Be patient. And I would warn Lucy Letby to do the same. The establishment will not give up easily. Even the shock value of this story of Baby O will not be enough to make them move. All any of us can do is keep talking about this until something changes, and until every mother can go into hospital to have their baby, knowing that the people working there are learning daily from the mistakes they make in order to not make them again. So that's my feelings on Mark McDonald's wonderful performance and real shot across the bow of the establishment. And I'll see you in the next episode, episode 48, where we're going to take a particular look in detail at Darry Evans and the things he said and how impossible they really are. So I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.